So you know kind of what the schedule is for the afternoon. Dr. Byness is going to present, and then afterwards we're going to take just a few-minute break to use the bathroom, hand out door prize tickets since the prizes came in, and then we'll reconvene for a question and answer period and door prizes before we end for the day. So without further ado, Dr. Byness.
All right. Yes, we are in business. Wow. So the last lecture of the bunch. It's hard to believe that my time here is almost drawing to a close, but it really has been a great blessing to be with you, not just sharing some mental health nuggets, but also having some wonderful fellowship and hearing some testimonies about how God is working in your life, and also just sharing, the encouragement of the fellowship that we have as a community of believers, as a community that are, walking life. Life's not easy, is it? Life can be challenging. And I always love that saying, joys shared are doubled and trials shared are what? Are halved. And I think that's a great equation because we need each other to encourage one another on the path of life, especially when it's challenging. Well, this afternoon we're going to be talking about enhancing emotional health in our young people. And as promised, we will be touching quite a bit on the media aspect because unfortunately that is impacting our young people significantly. And the caveat there is, though, there are multiple issues going on. And even though we're going to focus a fair amount there, to be fair, I don't think that's the only problem in our society, okay? So I just want to be clear. There are other issues at play. Just real quick, breeze through these. You all know that I'm from Beautiful Minds Medical Psychiatrist. I just did want to remind you, though, of our Choose Life acronym, which is a nice way to remember some of the main points for optimizing our mental health. And again, I always love how it starts with the C, the connection piece, because I think when we start with connection, it makes it so much easier to actually engage with the other aspects of holistic mental health. And so, meaning if we connect with one another, support one another, if we connect with God, then that enables us to do these other things optimally. And for more information, visit beautifulmindshealth.com, or you can check out our podcast, the Brain People Podcast. So when we talk about young people, who are these young people? Who are these young people? Well, we're primarily going to be focusing in on the Generation Z, the Zoomers, I guess some people say. Yeah, I had never really heard that term too much. So Generation Z is what we typically say. Some of this will also apply to millennials. And of course, then there's the baby generation, Generation Alpha. So they didn't get a very unique name. They just restarted the alphabet, I guess, after Generation Z. So if you look at the different generations, it'd be kind of interesting to ask here any people from Generation Alpha. Let's see, Generation Alpha. That would be people that are basically 14 and under. Any 14 and unders here? Oh, okay. Over there. All right, we have one, Generation Alpha. What about Generation Z? So that would be, let's see, let me do my math here, 27, yes, 27 through 15. 27 through 15, anyone here? All right, we got at least 1, 2, 3, okay, good. And what about millennials? Millennials born from 81 through 96. Okay, so we got a few millennials. What about Generation Xers? Okay, I'm a Generation Xer. 79, right here. And what about the baby boomers? All right, I think that's going to be our biggest group. So even though we're talking about young people, it's good to see the boomers here because they're in a lot of ways who need to help the younger people. So, and then the silent generation. Anyone here from the silent generation? Okay. Yay. Those are the ones we really look up to. It's an amazing generation. And what about the greatest generation? Anyone? That would be unusual. That would be would have to be someone that's almost 100 years old. I don't think we have anyone here from that, right? But all right, so that now you know what generation you're part of. Let's see if you resonate with any of these things. So the builders or the silent generation, that was World War II era, Model T Ford, roller skates, the record player, and more of a controlling leadership style, and an ideal leader is a commander type. Is that true for those of you from the silent generation? That's what they say. Okay, what about the baby boomers? You remember the moon landing, right? 1969. What about the Ford Mustang? And Frisbees. So I guess Frisbees didn't exist before then. And what about the cassettes? Yes. And yeah, the 8-track, right? And then more of a directing leadership style and a thinker. And then the Generation Xers. Oh yeah, we shouldn't forget about the slang terms, right? The builders, we prefer proper English. The boomers, be cool, peace, groovy, way out. And then the Generation X, dude, ace, as if, wicked, the stock market crash, the Holden Commodore. See, I don't even remember that. That's interesting. Even though I'm an Xer, I don't know. I guess that only had its moment and faded quickly. Rubik's Cube, I remember that. The Walkman, yeah, I always saw the cool kids, they had the Walkmans. And then more of a coordinating leadership style and more of a doer as far as the ideal leader. And then Generation Y, which would be the millennials. Don't forget your bling, right? Funky, dope. And so September 11 was important in their lives. The Toyota Prius. It's interesting because in our office, by far the biggest car that is driven by our staff is the Prius, and we have a lot of millennials. So I guess it goes to show. BMX bike, the iPod, and more of a supporting leadership style. Generation Z. I don't even know some of these. Yas Queen. So maybe I'll have to have some of the Generation Zers explain this stuff to me. The Tesla, the folding scooter, Spotify, an empowering leadership style and collaborator. And then Generation Alpha. These aren't even really words. Yeet, Hundu, oof. It's funny. I actually, the first time I found this slide, my 4-year-old, who obviously is Generation Alpha, she had just started saying oof, oof, oof to everything. I was like, yep, okay, I get it. COVID-19, the autonomous vehicles, the fidget spinner, fidget toys. I see these all over the place now, especially with some of my patients that have anxiety. More of an inspiring leadership style, and the co-creator. So this just gives you kind of a fun overview of the different generations and some of the differences. And there are distinct differences, and it's important for us to be acquainted with some of these cultural nuances so that we can actually understand the perspective of where people are coming from so we can address the needs that they have. One of the big things that we see is even before COVID-19, mental health challenges were the leading cause of disability and poor life outcomes in young people. So what we were seeing is that up to 1 in 5 children ages 3 to 17 in the US had a mental, emotional, developmental, or behavioral disorder. From 2009 to 2019, the share of high school students who reported persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness increased by 40% to more than 1 in 3 students. And unfortunately, we're seeing the trends continue, especially during COVID. Things really skyrocketed in a negative direction. So we've seen worsening trends. Generation Z adults were the most likely generation to say that their mental health has worsened compared with before the pandemic. Globally, depressive and anxiety symptoms in youth doubled during the pandemic. It was interesting because you'd think like, well, the young people, they're resilient, they're able to bounce back. But what we actually saw in reality was that they were the ones that suffered the most from a mental health standpoint, even more than the older generations that were isolated, many of which were even isolated in their senior care homes. I had several patients who didn't leave their senior care facilities literally for months during COVID, right? And yet somehow they were able to make it through oftentimes better than some of these younger people. Why do you think that might be, by the way? Why do you think COVID hit our younger generation so hard? They were separated. Okay, very good. So the isolation piece is a big part of it. Yeah, any other thoughts?
Well, for the young people, they're so used to being outdoors and playing and,
Mm-hmm.
and that time was right there in the beginning of the summer.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Yeah, so they were not only isolated, they were stuck indoors many times. Yes.
That's a really important time for them to socialize and get to
Yes. Yeah.
people and make it a lot of
Yes. So I think it was a combination of those factors, the isolation, but especially this element of not being able to socialize as much with their peers, because they would often have interactions with their family, but this is a time of life where they're supposed to be getting out there, connecting with other young people, looking at their future, looking at their careers, and kind of flying out of the nest, right? Creating a new life for themselves. And it was like many of them, I think, felt like my wings have not just been clipped, but almost completely cut off, if that makes sense. And they felt like, wow, this is my future, this is my life, and it became very depressing. And what we saw is that especially suicidal ideation increased dramatically. And again, I think suicidal ideation, the data shows that it's often very closely associated with a sense of hopelessness, futility. And I think that's what a lot of the young people started looking at. They started saying, hey, if this is what the future is going to be like of this country, of this world, etc., I don't even know if I want to deal with it. And so it really became quickly depressing. So bad, in fact, that there was an emergency declaration made in the fall of 2021 by the by the American Academy of Pediatrics and also the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry and the Children's Hospital Association. And then the U.S. Surgeon General issued an advisory on youth mental health crisis. And this was at the end of 2021. And the Surgeon General said mental health challenges in children, adolescents, and young adults are real and widespread. Even before the pandemic, an alarming number of young people struggled with feelings of helplessness, depression, and thoughts of suicide, and rates have increased. The future well-being of our country depends on how we support and invest in the next generation. It would be a tragedy if we beat back one public health crisis only to allow another to grow in its place. And this helps us to realize, sometimes there's unforeseen consequences for how we handle one fire, right? So we're running over here trying to put this fire out, like the COVID pandemic, and deal with that. But then sometimes that can worsen these problems over here. And so I'm hoping that when the next crisis happens, because we all know at some point there's going to be more crises, hopefully nothing exactly like COVID, but I am hoping we learn some important lessons, and instead of going into this complete fear state and worsening mental health, hopefully we learned a little bit more about supporting and working with each other so that the mental health will not get so much worse in the next crisis. So when we look at risk factors, what are the factors that shape mental health of young people? Because we want to understand better if indeed the mental health of our young people is worsening, which is very clear, from data, then what could be the risk factors and which one of those are the most important risk factors? So if you look at the Surgeon General's advisory report, we can see that there's several different risk factors, and we're not going to take the time to dive into all of these because I know it's after lunch, and I'll very quickly we'll have nap time for all of us. But suffice it to say, there's a lot of different risk factors. I mean, there's individual risk factors like age, genetics, etc. There's familial risk factors, things like relationships with parents and potential domestic violence, trauma. There's community. Is your community and your environment safe? That sort of thing. And then, of course, there's social and economic inequalities, discrimination. So there's a lot of different risk factors, right? So the question becomes, which factors do we need to pay attention to most closely? And the follow-up question to that is, what variables have changed to increase these mental health problems? Meaning, if we take a step back and we look at the last 20, 30 years, what has actually changed over that time? Why are we seeing such a big trend? Because if we look at these other risk factors that we were just talking about, like the individual, familial, community, environment, society, if those are risk factors, but if those are relatively stable, then we realize okay, they're probably not the big cause of the upward trend in mental health problems. Okay, so what we want to look at is which things have actually changed during the time that these tremendous increases in mental health problems have also changed. And that will help us identify what are the biggest issues we can focus on and potentially change. So while some believe that, and this is from the Surgeon General's report, that the trends in reporting of mental health challenges are partly due to young people becoming more willing to openly discuss mental health concerns, other researchers point to the growing use of digital media, increasing academic pressure, limited access to mental health care, health risk behaviors such as alcohol and drug use, and broader stressors such as the 2008 financial crisis, rising income inequality, racism, gun violence, and climate change. So I believe that yes, there is an element where we are diminishing stigma. So there are people that are a little more willing to talk about their mental health concerns. But I also believe that the data are accurate in that there is truly an increase in mental health problems because it is so dramatic. I don't think this is just because more people are talking about it. But again, when we look at these factors here, digital media, academic pressure, all of this, most of these are actually not significantly changed, meaning there's always been some degree of academic pressure. Actually, with mental health care, we have more access now in general than before. Health risk behaviors such as alcohol and drug use, there's some data that's coming out that's actually showing, at least for alcohol, teens are drinking less. Now, cannabis is a different story, okay? And I have a whole lecture on cannabis. I'm not going to go too far down that path, but what I will say is don't let mainstream media or any kind of cannabis propaganda fool you. Cannabis is not good for your mental health, okay? The data is very, very clear, and I see it all the time with my patients. In fact, sometimes I'll have a patient come in and they tell me that they're using cannabis, and I ask them why, and they tell me something like, well, maybe to help me fall asleep, and also to help my anxiety and my depression and my ADD. And then, so I ask them, well, why are you here to see me? Well, for my anxiety, my depression, my ADD, and my insomnia. I'm like, well, it's not working so well, is it? And the thing about cannabis is that it actually often helps initially, but in the long run, it worsens the symptoms. Plus, if you have any kind of prone genes for psychosis, there's a tenfold increased risk of triggering a psychotic episode or even a psychotic disorder, I should say, if you start using cannabis. And even if you don't develop a full-blown psychotic disorder, studies show that long-term heavy users of cannabis are at a very high risk of developing psychotic symptoms, even if it's not full-blown schizophrenia, like a level of paranoia and magical thinking and this sort of thing. So just that's kind of an aside. But broader stressors, yes, there are more stressors, so that could definitely be playing a role. Like I said, I don't think it's just one thing, but there are a couple of things. I really do think the stressors are playing a big role in the increase in youth mental health problems. But the other thing we're going to talk about here is related to Dr. Twenge, I don't know how to say her name, Dr. Jean Twenge's research. She's a professor of psychology at San Diego State University. She's authored more than 120 peer-reviewed publications and has been researching generational differences in America for over 25 years. And she recently wrote a book called iGen. She was advocating that the Generation Zs be actually called iGen because she discovered how media is having a tremendous impact on the mental health of young people. In her research, Dr. Twenge was accustomed to seeing slowly growing trends, hills to peaks. Around 2011 to 2012, however, she started seeing abrupt shifts in teens' behavior and emotional states, more like sheer cliffs. So let me show you a graph of that. So you can see here, this is depressive symptoms in teenage girls. And boom, right around 2011, 2012, there was a huge spike. What correlated with that? What do you see here? Social media use and internet hours. And so what we see is that right around that time, there was a huge spike in the use of media, specifically social media. And what we found in research is that especially adolescent girls are very prone to the negative impact of social media. So, by the way, why was it that internet hours and social media use spiked so quickly in 2011 to 2012? Yes. Yeah, that was the year. So the iPhone actually came out, I think it was in 2007. Yes, I see my notes here, the 2007. But it wasn't until 2011, 2012 that more than half of Americans started owning their own smartphones. And so now it was much more accessible. And so that's why even teenagers started using the media a lot more. And so Common Sense Media in 2019, just over half of children in the United States, 53%, now own a smartphone by the age of 11. And I'm sure this is higher now, right? This is 5 years later. 84% of teenagers now have their own smartphones. The interesting thing is, I was actually talking to Matt about this a little bit, and he mentioned that the fastest growing segment of phone sales is the dumb phones. So it does seem we have a little bit of good news. Does anyone know what a dumb phone is? Like an old school phone that you can't access the internet on, basically. And there's a segment of the population that's saying, okay, look, this is not going anywhere good, anywhere fast, and they're actually going back to the simpler times. So I did touch on this last night, but I just want to make sure that we all understand what media can actually do to our brain. So electronic media can be highly addictive. Remember that dopamine pathway that I was sharing last night. So essentially what happens when you engage with media, especially with the fast-moving media that we have nowadays, it stimulates that dopamine response. And that makes you feel good in the emotional part of your brain, but it also shuts down your frontal lobe. And so like illicit drugs, media overuse hijacks the brain's reward system, damages the frontal lobe and impairs decision-making, reduces concentration and focus, diminishes ability to empathize and connect with others, and diminishes life's simple pleasures. So a couple things that I want to just pause and think about with you on this is the empathy piece. Let's start with that. So one thing that I've recognized, even as a psychiatrist, observing trends with young people and even my interviews with people, especially the young people who come in and are depressed, but even some of them that aren't fully depressed, a lot of them tend to have a very flat, what we call flat affect. Have any of you noticed that? There's this level of withdrawal and disengagement that we're seeing. And that's because if you're busy staring at a screen, what you're learning is not how to connect with people. And see, when you're staring at a screen, your mirror, what we call mirror neurons. Has anyone heard of mirror neurons before? A couple of you? Your mirror neurons are not activated in exactly the same way. They are activated on some levels, but the point being, it's much more difficult to actually learn empathy when you're interacting with a screen as opposed to when you're interacting with real people. And there's a distance that's actually created. If you think about like the violence that we watch on television or the other behavior that is not conducive with good, healthy values of valuing life and helping and that sort of thing, it makes us kind of almost numb to suffering, right? And numb to other people. So there's multiple reasons, but suffice it to say that when we engage with a lot of screen time, especially in adolescence, because that's when we are learning how to read people, it's when we're learning how to interact with other people and have those facial expressions and even develop the caring that moves us to compassion for other people, that part starts to get stifled and attenuated. And so that, to me, is a scary thing. The other piece that I'll mention here, too, think about it this way. When you're engaging in media, the logical part of the brain is decreased in activity, right? So what that means is not only is that creating a problem with, remember how I was talking about predisposition for mental health problems, has to do with overactivity of the emotional part of the brain, underactivity of the frontal lobe. Well, not only is that an issue, but think about it this way. If all that information is coming in and you're not critically evaluating what's going in, do you think that that is a good thing? No. So basically, all this information from the programs that we're watching, the social media we're engaging with, the commercials that we're viewing, that is going in relatively unfiltered into our subconscious mind, and it's influencing our decisions, the way that we live day by day. And if you don't believe me, I mean, think about it this way. Why would they spend millions and billions of dollars on advertising every year, right? Because they know all that is essentially brainwashing us. You know, it's coming in and it's changing our behavior. If we went to if I went to the store and I was hungry and I went to the checkout line, then I might see a Snickers bar out of the corner of my eye, right? Now, am I thinking about the latest Snickers commercial? I'm like, oh yeah, I remember that commercial, and the guy got the Snickers, and he was really happy. Am I thinking about that consciously? No. But what's going on in my mind? Well, what's going on in my subconscious mind is that I am remembering that subconsciously, and that is actually priming my buying decision on an emotional standpoint. Because what we need to realize is that most of our decisions are actually not based on logic. Science actually shows that the majority of the decisions that we make are based on what? Emotion. They're impulse buys, and this feels right, so I'm going to do it. That is actually what most of our decisions are based on. And so what television is banking on, or any kind of advertising, is if they can engage the emotion, they don't need you to explicitly remember the commercial that you watched. There just needs to be a brain association, and now when you are triggered by certain circumstances, you're going to be influenced because subconsciously you remember Snickers really satisfies, right? Does that make sense to everybody? So again, there's a big danger here because it's changing our values, it's changing the way that we think and we behave. So excessive media use is harmful for everyone, but kids are especially vulnerable. Excess screen time impairs normal development. Screen time recommendations, I recommend 0 screen time for children under 2. and no more than 1 hour of supervised use after the age of 5. And even for adults, we should be doing no more than 1.5 hours per day. Now, when I say screen time, I'm talking about entertainment screen time. If you're using it for work or something like that, that's different, okay? Because for work, it's not jumping from one scene to the next. There's a big difference. Do you understand that? In other words, it's those edits. It's shifting from one screen to the next that actually shuts the frontal lobe down and overstimulates the limbic system. And it is important for that 1 hour after age 5 to be supervised, because kids get into all sorts of crazy stuff. I've heard of these horror stories about kids being involved, sucked into like sex trafficking and that sort of thing because of their online activity. So we have to be extremely careful what our kids are viewing, not just for that reason, but for some of the other things we've touched on. So what are some signs of addiction, both in ourselves and in our young people? So constantly checking the phone, aimless clicking and scrolling, binge watching TV, shows or short videos, social isolation or conflict. And this is something that I see, again, a lot of young people that are addicted to screens are very isolated, and they would just as soon stay in their room. A lot of them, the saddest examples, I think, are those where the parents did not intervene early in their lives, and now they're in their mid to late 20s, sitting at home in a dark room, up most of the night, sleeping most of the day, playing video games most of the night, smoking cannabis. It's this pattern I've seen time and again, and it is very sad, very sad. Loss of interest, trouble focusing, difficulty sleeping. A lot of young people are struggling with sleep deficits, which can set the stage for lots of other mental health problems. And a big part of that is often related to screens. And then anxiety or irritability. Some of these young kids are very anxious and sometimes very angry and agitated if you even talk about taking their phone away, for example. I've had young people have complete meltdowns when that's happened, to the point where they've thrown things at the wall, they've broken things. And these aren't just like little 5 or 6 year old kids. These are like 14, 15, 16-year-old kids, right? And so young people can lose it if they have those addictive tendencies. But if you're seeing that in your young people, all the more reason that the worst thing you can do is say, okay, well, this is too big of a fight, I give up, okay? We have to actually help our young people to understand, yes, technology is a tool, and it's a useful tool, but we need to learn how to manage it properly. Otherwise, it will control our lives. So I want to be clear, and that's a good point. I want to be clear, I'm not anti-technology. This might sound like I am, but I use technology every day. But again, we need to use it as a powerful tool, kind of like, a chainsaw, right? Chainsaw is a powerful tool. We have to use it because of how powerful it is. That's how much more careful we have to be with it, right? All right. One of the scary things is that high-speed media content exposure in childhood can actually contribute to ADD and decrease concentration and memory. And this seems to be due, in part at least, to brain pruning that happens in the brain. In other words, some of the nerve cells get pruned away if they're engaging in too much screen time early on. And that makes it more difficult for them to concentrate and for the frontal lobe to even develop properly. Children may learn more from devices than from their parents. And unfortunately, nowadays, they often trust devices, what they hear online, over their parents. And we have a big responsibility as parents. When parents use devices, children tend to use theirs even more. And I know I've been guilty of this. I'm not perfect in this myself, even though, I'm talking to myself when I'm giving this lecture, because we have to constantly be checking ourselves, like, what kind of example are we to our children? Do we think that, it's not an issue for me, so I can use it however I want? Well, be careful with that, because what message are we actually sharing to our children? Video games, gaming addiction increases depression, anxiety, and social isolation. Violent gaming strengthens limbic brain and weakens the frontal lobe, like we said with any of these things. And research actually shows that frequent gaming increases irritability and aggressive thoughts. So there's two main types of screen time. There is passive screen time, like watching a television show or a movie or something like that, where you're not actively engaged with it. And then there's active screen time, where you're actually engaged with it. So you're playing a video game, you're on social media, scrolling, that sort of thing. Which do you think is worse for the brain, the passive or the interactive? Why would you say that? Yeah, and you're actually right. So the research shows that the interactive screen time, because I used to think, even in training, and I remember my psychiatry professor telling me, like, well, video games actually might not be that bad because it forces them to interact and to kind of learn how to like respond quickly and that sort of thing. So they have to really focus on the game, all right? But the truth is that interactive screen time has been shown to actually cause more problems because, again, it's even more overactivating for the emotional part, the limbic system, and suppress even more frontal lobe suppressing. And by the way, it's not just when young people or even adults are engaged with entertainment media that you get that frontal lobe suppression. That frontal lobe suppression can go on for hours afterwards, depending on how much people have engaged prior. Attention spans have decreased significantly since the smartphone era began. Media addiction has a similar effect to ADD. Ability to focus is directly correlated with proximity to the smartphone. So they actually did a study on this. They took 520 students, given 2 tests on intellectual acuity. And the only variable was the location of their smartphone. So they either put it on the desk, in their pocket, or in another room. Okay, so there was 3 different variables. And what they found is that the phones that had the subjects that had their phones in view right there had the worst scores on these intellectual tests. The ones that were out of sight, actually out of the room, those were the ones that had the best scores. So it's interesting because nearly all of them said that their phones hadn't been a distraction. And that's a lesson even for us, because part of addiction is denial and not even realizing how it's affecting us. So most of us feel like, oh yeah, digital distraction and media addiction, that's other people's problem. But the reality is that oftentimes we have an issue with it and we're not even aware of it. And so we need to often take a look in the mirror when we're talking about these things. Now, it's interesting. There was one study that Dr. Twenji did. This was even before the iPhone came out, but it still is telling just with the trends even before the iPhone. And I believe this is also related to technology, mainly, the advent of the television and movies and that sort of thing. Because the television actually didn't come out until after World War II. Large generational increases in mental health problems among American college students between 1938 and 2007, and high school students between 1951 and 2002. What we found there is that 5 times as many now score above common cutoffs for mental health problems. So that's a big increase, isn't it? And the conclusion of Dr. Twenji's study is the results best fit a model citing cultural shifts toward extrinsic goals such as materialism and status, and away from intrinsic goals such as community, meaning in life, and affiliation. So essentially what they're saying and what they're finding in the research is due to the advent of consumerism over the last 70 plus years, people are changing their value system. And there's a lot of research I could actually point to showing what happened in the 1950s and the 1960s to make that change. In other words, after World War II, you had the advent of mass media, you had a lot more commercials coming in, people felt like, ooh, I need the latest and greatest. buying went like crazy, the economy went like crazy, and pretty soon everyone felt like, oh, I need to keep up with the Joneses, and I need this and this and this, and indebtedness grew rapidly. And so again, what we see is a big shift in our cultural thinking from being more about community, connection, and affiliation, and much more about what's going to make me feel good, instant gratification, and it's all about me, right? I mean, even think about the iPhone. It's all about right? The iPad. Everything has to go around me. So what is being done, and will it be enough? Well, it's interesting because even people on the higher political levels of the country are waking up to these problems. In fact, this is just a couple of months ago in August. 42 state attorney generals demand a Surgeon General warning label for social media apps. So like how they have the warning on cigarettes, like this is hazardous to your health, it might kill you, all right? They're literally talking about putting a similar warning label on social media. Amen. I think that's a good thing. Yeah, right? I think it's a big blessing, but it just helps you to see, like, I'm not just here alone saying, like, okay, this is bad. People are actually waking up to how bad it is. The Washington Post reports in their letter to Congress, the state attorneys general said a social media warning label would not only highlight the inherent risks that social media platforms presently pose for young people, but also complement other efforts to spur attention, research, and investment into the oversight of social media platforms. Amid mental health concerns, more states implementing restrictions on cell phone use in schools. So they're talking about warning labels. They're talking about putting restrictions in schools. I think these are good things. They're good public health ways of approaching it. But that by itself is not going to cut it, right? We do need to do more. Now, there is a good book that we don't have time to get into an exhaustive way to deal with this afternoon, but I do want to refer you to a good book written by Dr. Victoria Dunkley called Reset Your Child's Brain. Reset Your Child's Brain. And this is a 4-week plan to end meltdowns, raise grades, and boost social skills by reversing the effects of electronic screen time. Dr. Dunkley is actually a psychiatrist in Southern California, and she will not even diagnose a child with ADHD or some of these other disorders, anxiety disorders, depression, etc., until they've gone through an electronic fast and been essentially, for the most part, media-free for at least 1 month, if not even more. Because what she's seen over and over again is that when kids go through these media fasts, is that their disorders get better. It's amazing. And kids are resilient, but it's important to try to address that as soon as possible. Just to highlight her 3 most important rules: keep the bedroom free of all screen devices, use a wired desktop workstation, because a lot of kids have to do their work on the computer for school and whatnot, but make it like basically hardwired. Don't let them move it all over the place, right? Number 3, model the screen rules yourself. Model the screen rules yourself. A few additional caveats: encourage as much hands-on learning as possible, including real books. Foster, they found in research that the more media young people use, the worse their mental health, but the more they read, the better their mental health. Okay? Foster a sense of purpose. Study show a sense of purpose limits how emotionally reactive people are to social media triggers, so we want to give them a sense of purpose. Remember that kids are not missing out on connection if you don't give them a smartphone. The opposite is actually true. Because there's this thing that most of you probably heard of called FOMO, right? FOMO, fear of missing out. And so kids will often feel like, well, all my friends have this, and how could you not allow me to? I'm not going to be able to connect with my friends, and all this catastrophic thinking that can come up. But the truth is that they will actually be happier if they can connect with people in real life rather than on media. And they've done studies that support this. And no electronics during dinner. Make it a sacred time. Studies show the importance of family dinner time in adolescent mental health and behavior. So it's really important to have that time of connection during mealtime. So beyond media, let's talk a little bit about what does research actually show is the most important key to navigate adolescence successfully. What do you think? What might be the most important thing? Support, okay. So the research actually shows that it is self-regulation or self-control. But, yeah, and higher achievement in school, success in work, more financial success, more satisfying relationships. So basically being able to say no to the right things, yes to the right things, using their time wisely, all that. Better physical and mental health. And the good news is it can be learned. But the problem is when the adolescent brain is changing and going through puberty, puberty is kind of like an accelerator. So what it does is it stimulates all the hormonal changes and everything have a huge effect on this part of the brain down here. And this part of the brain is the logical part of the brain or the emotional part of the brain? The emotional. And now you know why teenagers tend to be more emotional, right? So this part of the brain starts being activated with puberty very strongly, especially the nucleus accumbens. And the nucleus accumbens is hypersensitive to reward. And this is why young people love to find things that are exciting and exhilarated, and they like taking risks because they're so sensitive here. It feels so good to take those risks and to, play with the edge, right? And so that part of the brain is developing, and that's like the accelerator. But the self-control part, which is the frontal lobe, lags in development. And so that part is not driven by puberty, and so that part is not going to develop until fully develop until between the ages of 25 and 30. And think about this, back 100 years ago, puberty actually started much later, oftentimes 14, 15, even 16 years old. Now puberty is often starting around 10, 11 years old. And so what we're seeing this huge amount of time where people are in adolescence until maturation, right? And that leaves room for a lot of problems to develop. And so they're hypersensitive to rewards, hyposensitive to consequences, and hypersensitive to social relationships, especially peers. And so we end up with a picture like this, right? Where the teenager's like, yay, life is great and fun, I just want to enjoy. And the parents are like, no. So how do we help our young people to develop healthy self-control? Well, I'll tell you one thing. Giving them devices, is that going to help the problem? Do you think it might worsen the problem? That's exactly what it does, because again, it's going to overstimulate even more. But that's also why young people are so attractive to devices, because it stimulates the nucleus accumbens. So what do we need to do? Do we need to just educate them more? So most systematic research in health education indicates that even the best programs are successful at changing adolescents' knowledge, but what? Not in altering their behavior. So what we want to do oftentimes is just try to educate our young people and say, well, this is good for you, this is bad for you, do what's good for you. So young people usually know what's good for them. That doesn't mean that's going to drive the decision to do what's better for them, right? Because it feels so good sometimes to do what's not good for them, they don't really care, right? And even for some of us adults, we're guilty of that sometimes. So intellectually, adolescents can understand consequences, but emotionally, they are less sensitive to them, in large part because they are drawn more strongly to the potential of rewards. So what is the most important contributor to self-control or self-regulation? Research actually shows, and someone alluded to this earlier, it's a committed, stable relationship with a supportive adult. It's a committed, stable relationship with a supportive adult. And that would equal family and church family. Sometimes we want to shirk the responsibility and say, you know what? This is a problem with the kid. They need to get it together and learn their lesson and kind of want to wash our hands of it. But the reality is our young people actually need the support. They need us to walk through life with them and give them those limits and parameters. And yes, they're going to fight us on those, but in the long run, they're going to do much better. And most of them, maybe not all of them, but most of them, if we put those limits and parameters, if we apply those correctly, they will actually be thankful in the end that we didn't allow them to go beyond certain limits. Yes, we want to allow them to get out there, to explore, to sometimes push the envelope a bit, but we want to keep them safe, and it's important to do that. So what are some things that we can do to, as family members and involved adults? So we just talked about this. Parents alone, I will say, are not enough. So the parents have obviously a huge responsibility, but we need to recognize that ideally the best, or let me put it this way, the ideal sort of situation that young people can be raised is a large family, not just parents. Because who here have parents or young children, like relatively young, under 18? Yeah. Is that an easy job? Whew. Is it exhausting some days? Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of days where my wife and I just look at each other and like, oh, we made it through another day. Praise God, right? House is still standing. Yeah, it might be kind of a wreck. It can be exhausting. And so for us as parents to be doing this all by ourselves is virtually impossible, especially with today's fast-paced society. And even the Surgeon General is recognizing this. He issued a public health advisory, this was just August of this year, about the effects of stress on parents' mental health. And basically, he's calling the government, businesses, and community organizations to increase resources to provide them more support. It highlighted a long list of issues that stress out parents and called for policy changes and better community support for them, other caregivers, and families as a whole. Among the advisor's policy recommendations, Murthy pressed for federal, state, tribal, and local governments to expand funding that supports parents, establish a national paid family and medical leave program, see to it that workers have paid sick time, and provide caregivers with access to affordable mental health care options. The advisory describes how mothers and fathers now work many more hours than in 1985, but also spend many more hours every week on primary child care. And that doesn't count their total time spent with children. The advisory says demands from both work and child caregiving have come at the cost of quality time with one's partner, sleep, and parental leisure time. In the advisory, Murthy said 41% of parents say they are so stressed most days they can't function, and 48% say their stress is completely overwhelming compared to other adults. So if you feel a high level of stress, you're not alone as a parent. And if you're not a parent with young children, I hope this is a bit of a wake-up call for you, realizing, hey, maybe there's things I can do to support the families with young children, right? Because here he's saying, hey, we need to do more with the government. We need to do more with the cities. We need to do more with, but what about the church? Isn't this what God has called us to be as a large family of God, to support one another? And I'm not trying to be critical here. I'm just asking, like, can we maybe get out of our comfort zone a little bit to help each other, right? And we've been blessed, don't get me wrong. We've been very blessed by many people who have reached out and supported our family. But without that, I don't know where we would be, especially like I mentioned in my sermon today, with our special needs daughter. It's not an easy path at all. And if we were trying to do it all alone, we would be in the psych hospital ourselves. So, a couple things I want to mention real quick about the Seventh-day Adventist Church. 2 out of 5 people leave the Seventh-day Adventist Church. 62.5% of those stated that they were young adults at the time of leaving. There was a 2010 report that was a longitudinal study over 10 years that showed nearly 50% of Adventist youth surveyed had left the church or were inactive members by their mid-20s. In 2015, Alan Martin estimated 60 to 70% of SDA youth are leaving the church. So I would say it seems like, at least half, really. But what's fascinating is that in 2014, they did a survey that showed that nearly 80% of the youth surveyed said that they always or often loved the Adventist church and would never leave it for any reason. So why is it that we're losing? So in youth, they're saying, no, I would never leave, like in the younger years. But then by young adulthood, most of them are gone. Why is that? Well, in a 2018 survey, 7 out of 10 respondents agreed or strongly agreed with the statement that I was able to talk to one or both of my parents about religious issues. This suggests that there is reasonably good intergenerational communication about beliefs. This result suggests we need to look elsewhere for a cause. One of the more striking findings of both the church member surveys was the very low incidence of family worship. So that could be one of the big smoking guns here. There was a European study that showed that youth who felt they could develop an original position in their faith by asking questions and challenging church leaders said they are more likely to remain in church compared to youth in congregations that just emphasize conformity. Do you think it's important to allow our young people to ask questions, to have real dialogue with them? The key is to provide an environment of frank, open, and transparent exchanges. A young person's decision to become an Adventist was found to be more influenced in the long run by family, a church pastor, and other adults at church than by a youth pastor or peers. And one big element of all of this is the father's role. Personal sharing and interaction with a father on issues of faith greatly increases the possibility of young people foreseeing themselves as Adventists in adulthood. While researchers said that mothers are usually the bedrock of faith in the home, it's fathers who might actually determine a positive decision for church. Survey respondents who discussed faith issues with their father were 70% more likely to foresee themselves remaining in the church than those who said their father didn't discuss religion with them. And one issue that we're seeing is that a lot of young people feel like they're almost graduating from church. When we give responsibility to a young person, it's usually in the youth department or music, she said. But an involvement in other areas would allow for more contact with older generations. Not that youth ministry involvement is a bad thing. It can help young people mature and contribute to generational diversity. However, when youth lead other youth, a pattern of generational segregation might emerge. The trend is seen in the Adventist church and in other denominations. Many times, a young person graduates from youth ministry and ends up also graduating from church. Because now, where's my place? What's the purpose that I'm coming to church? How am I contributing, right? Does that make sense? And so I think there's a big, we have a responsibility to look for young people to be involved, not just in youth ministry, but in other positions, in other ministries, and even in leadership roles, being mentored, of course, but being engaged. That will help them have a sense of purpose and make them want to stay. So key factors, just as a review: engagement with family, especially fathers, regular family worship. And I've noticed this even in my own family. I used to be like, okay, we have our evening worship, but I've noticed a difference in my children. In the Bible, they had the morning and the evening sacrifice, right? And so for the last few months, my wife encouraged me. She's like, we should really be doing morning worship together too. And it's hard because I want to race off to work and I have 50 million things to do, but I'm like, okay, you're right. And so we've made it a point, even if we have to get the kids up a little earlier, even if I'm a little later to work, to do that, and it makes a difference. Room for independent thinking, so we need to have those dialogues, intergenerational versus peer-to-peer contact, and engage as leaders in various church activities. Ellen White says that very much has been lost to the cause of God because of inattention to the young. There is a great reluctance on the part of many to become acquainted with the youth. But it is accounted of heaven a neglect of duty, a sin against souls for whom Christ died. The youth are objects of Satan's special attacks, and the manifestation of kindness, courtesy, tender sympathy, and love will often work the salvation of those who are under the temptations of the evil one. To me, that is a very sobering quote. And it also highlights that we are so quick to judge our young people when they're struggling with various issues. But what should we have? We should have compassion. We should have sympathy, realizing at no time in Earth's history, I think, have young people been more tempted. I mean, there is so much of an attack on our young people. The love of Jesus will win you an entrance into the hearts of the young. And when you have obtained the confidence of the youth, they will listen to your words and take your counsel. Do you get that? In other words, when we win their hearts, that's when they will listen to us. But we just expect them to listen to us because we're older and we have more wisdom. Isn't that pretty presumptive? If someone's coming to you and giving you unsolicited advice, and they don't really even seem like they care about your well-being or your heart, they're not really caring for your heart, how much are you going to want to listen to their advice, even if it's good advice? You're going to be rebel, right? You're going to be like, I'm not going to listen to you. And yet that's what we do so often with our young people. You should bind them to your heart by the cords of love and then instruct them how to labor in the cause of God. Why should this labor for the youth in our borders not be thought the highest of missionary work? Wow. And I love the prophecy in Malachi that says, "See, I will send the prophet Elijah to you before the great and dreadful day of the Lord. He will turn the hearts of the parents to their children and the hearts of the children to their parents." And so I think that in order for us to see the fulfillment of that prophecy, we need to be involved. So the final thing I wanted to touch on is adult-child relationship styles, because if we want to learn how to be there and be present and connect with our young people, we have to do it properly. So there's 3 types. There's the autocratic, which is cold, firm, and psychologically controlling. Do it because I said so. And then that used to be kind of the predominant, maybe we'd say in the 60s and 70s. But then you had what? The self-esteem movement come in, right? and with the self-esteem movement, what was the main cause of mental health problems that so-called good psychologists and scientists were saying? It was low self-esteem, right? So what do we need to do? We need to just tell kids how amazing they are and how good they are and just let them do what they want, and they're going to grow up into the people that they were meant to be. So that's what we call permissive, warm, lenient, passive. I just want you to be happy, right? Now, in some ways, we might almost say if you're going to err, maybe err a little bit on the permissive side, but believe me, the pendulum swung way over for most people. And what we want is in the middle. We want authoritative, which means, yes, warm, but at the same time firm and supportive. I want you to do this because, and research clearly shows that people that have that sort of parenting style, or the children that have that sort of grow up with that parenting style, have better self-regulation, which again is the number one predictor of good outcome, more confident, poised, determined, and self-reliant. So how do we do that? Well, again, we want to be warm. I'm just going to run through this quickly because of time. You can't love your child too much. You want to be physically affectionate, try to understand, respond to your child's emotional needs, provide a safe haven, be involved in your child's life. And yes, the strongest and most consistent predictor of children's mental health, adjustment, happiness, and well-being is the degree to which their parents are involved in their lives. But the other side of this is we have the helicopter parents too, right? that are overly involved. So involvement is super important, but if we're so involved that we're not allowing children to actually explore and try things on themselves by themselves, and sometimes even risk a little bit of harm, but not big harm, but make some. Then they're going to become overly dependent on that guidance. So it's a fine balance, but we do want to be involved. That's super important. It takes time and hard work, and we need both mom and dad, and we need to sometimes reprioritize, sacrifice. And I would also say it takes a church family as well. And then be firm, make expectations clear, explain your rules and decisions, be consistent, be fair, avoid harsh punishment. But it's important to have those clear. You don't need a lot of rules, but make them clear and be consistent with them. And there needs to be consequences, because guess what? That's the real world, right? And finally, be supportive. Set the stage for success, not failure. Praise your child's accomplishments, but focus on effort, not the outcome. And by the way, we don't need to give trophies for every little thing, okay? Don't be overly intrusive. Relinquish control gradually. Help your child think through decisions. Protect when you must, but permit when you can. Again, we want to give kids that opportunity to actually grow up and explore and try things. Beautiful thing is, as Seventh-day Adventists, we have a blessing of the Sabbath connection. This is an opportunity to reprioritize ourselves and our families, our relationships, reconnect, rejoice together, and try faith experiments together on the Sabbath and serve together. And remember, we need our young people too. They help us even in the process of our spiritual growth. So the conclusion is building a warm, firm, consistent relationship with an adolescent will be the biggest difference maker in their life. We need to allow them to ask tough questions, and we need to keep them involved and be involved with them. And the question is, do you know one? Do you know of an adolescent? And yes, I know we all know of one. And so just try those little things, just show an interest. Stop and ask them, how are you doing? What are you interested in? And see how we can be of support to the families and to our young people. It reminds me of when I was a young person. My parents went through a really difficult time. When I was 13 years old, and my dad is still a Seventh-day Adventist pastor, so this was especially hard, being a PK. My parents sat us down, and I was 13 years old, and they told us that we are getting a divorce. It was like a bombshell hit, and it was the last thing that I expected. But we didn't know, what to do with that at all as young people. It was like, okay, at the age of 13, you don't have the emotional capacity to deal with something like that when your family is disintegrating in front of your eyes. And so for us kids, we all dealt with our pain in different ways. And my brother and I got into different habits and chose friends and got into all sorts of stuff that wasn't healthy for us, just as an escape, because we were looking for some way to deal with our own pain and find some sense of belonging and some sense of direction in our life. And so through this process, I was not going in a good direction. But it was amazing because there was a man, an older man at our church. He was a very interesting fellow. He was actually an undercover FBI agent. He would carry around a gun and that sort of thing, like a concealed weapon. and so a very interesting guy, but he took a special interest in me. And he saw that, things weren't going so good for our family. But he said, you know what, maybe I can get him involved in something. And so he knew I liked the outdoors, I liked hiking, and so he signed me up for this group called the Ptarmigans. And he said, I want to support you in getting involved. And so he signed me up for this class, this mountaineering class that I was able to take. And I'll never forget, through this process, he actually took me to REI, and he said, okay, you know what? Let's go and figure out what you need for mountaineering, because we were going to climb Mount Hood at the end of the mountaineering class. And so he said, whatever you need, I'm going to buy you. And here's my credit card. We're just going to buy it, right? So we picked out like the nicest gear, right? And I mean, I'm talking about North Face jacket, North Face fleece, the boots, the crampons, everything. He bought it all for me. And I'll never forget, at the end, right before we went up to the cash register, he sat me down and he said, do me one favor. And I said, sure, anything after you're doing this for me, right? He said, turn your back on organized religion, turn your back on the Adventist church, but never turn your back on Jesus. Jesus loves you, and he will always be there for you, and he has a plan for your life. And I'll never forget that. And that made a huge difference. Who knows where I'd be today without those sorts of influences in my life? So never underestimate the impact that each one of you can make on our young people. We need to be that example, yes, but we also need to take a proactive interest in seeing how we can support those in our sphere. And it can make a big difference, not just in success for this life, but in the success for eternal life. All right, well, thank you so much. That's all I had to share. I appreciate your interest and attention. Thank you. And I think we're going to just take a little 10-minute break and then have a little Q&A and wrap things up.
Yes, so we're going to take a 10-minute break. Deanna Spencer has set out a table out in the lobby with just some different mental health resources in our community. If anyone is interested, please stop by and take a look. Also, Jen in the back has tickets for the door prizes. And so we'll reconvene at about 3:25, if that's okay. So it's closer to 8 minutes for the question and answer period. And if you have questions you would like to submit, there are some papers on the table. If you could just bring them to me, that would be great. Thank you. Alrighty, we're going to go ahead and get started. So if we could have you find your seat, or if you want to stand because it's been a long day, feel free to stand in the back. Thank you for submitting questions. I'm just going to go ahead and we'll ask Dr. Vinus to share his insights. Do you want to start with that one? Okay.
I guess I can start with this one since it's related to what we were just talking about. So the question is, it is evident that the use of social media has diminished critical thinking skills in young people. How can young people regain their critical thinking and problem-solving skills? So the good news is that young people have a lot of neuroplasticity still happening. The highest period of neuroplasticity basically means the brain's ability to change for the better. And the highest period of neuroplasticity is when? What ages? 0 to 3, yeah. 0 to 3, 4. So that's, think about how many changes go on in the brain during that time, right? A baby is born knowing how much? Nothing, right? And just in 1 to 2 years, they're starting to walk, starting to talk, starting to do all sorts of amazing things, right? And so there's a lot of neuroplasticity, but adolescence is actually the second highest period of neuroplasticity. And so even if the brain has been damaged to some degree through media, the neuroplasticity allows the brain to bounce back quickly. However, if the issue that's triggering the problem is not addressed early enough, then the longer it's a problem, and meaning the overexposure to media, the more difficult it is to bounce back. But essentially, the best way to regain critical thinking skills is, number one, to stop the damage. So get a handle, like do an electronic fast, and have strict parameters for how much social media and technology you're using and how you're using that, when you're using that. And then number two, do things, activities that actually will engage the critical thinking parts of your mind. So that would be things like actually forcing yourself to do hard things, like problem solving. Even jigsaw puzzles are actually good for the frontal lobe. Crossword puzzles, of course, the exercise, all these things that we talked about yesterday for enhancing the frontal lobe, that will help critical thinking, as well as trying to stretch ourselves with scholastically and other practical problem-solving skills, and even trying new things in the home, and maybe like trying handyman things and that sort of thing. So that will help the brain to bounce back. Okay. Next question.
What traumatic untreated brain injuries, what is the effect of long-term health issues with this happening?
So with traumatic brain injuries, this is something that can often change someone very significantly. And there's a wide variety of ways that it can affect people, because it depends a lot on how severe the injury is and the location as well. But essentially, the inflammation initially can cause all sorts of problems, including memory issues, including sometimes seizures and that sort of thing. But a lot of times, the frontal lobe is damaged with traumatic brain injuries, because the frontal lobe, since it's the most sophisticated part of the brain, and because it's right here in the front, is often very vulnerable to either direct impact or what we call a counter-coup injury. So where you get like whiplash, for example, and the brain kind of rattles around in your skull, and you can kind of get a brain bruise. And the frontal lobe is very vulnerable to that. And so essentially, a lot of people that struggle with traumatic brain injury will have a personality change. They will often lose their ability to control their emotions very well, or their choices very well, so they'll become more impulsive and sometimes rude and crude and this sort of thing. The classic example is Phineas Gage. Some of you maybe have heard of that case study, where he was a railroad worker back in the 1800s, and he got a tamping iron through his forehead, which destroyed his left frontal lobe, and that left him with the inability to control his emotions, and he completely changed. So it can have huge repercussion on relationships, on your ability to think and problem solve and live. But again, it varies tremendously based on where that injury is. It's an area of a specialty that ideally you would see a traumatic brain injury specialist, so that you can get the support both from physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy sometimes as well. And then there are often certain supplements that can be helpful in the healing process as well.
What part of the brain do amphetamine-based ADHD medications affect? Can they make you feel emotionally numb?
Okay, so stimulant medications for ADHD basically work to affect two areas of the brain, a little bit in the limbic system, the emotional part of your brain, to stimulate that, and that can help with like motivation and energy and that sort of thing. And then also, but the main focus and the main reason that we want to give stimulants to people with ADHD is that it actually does, as long as it's not overstimulating, like for example, if someone did methamphetamine, that is a lot of amphetamine all at one time, and what would happen there is you get overstimulation in the frontal lobe, and that shuts the frontal lobe down. But just a little bit of stimulation for people with ADHD, they have their neurological system needs a little more stimulation, and that actually improves frontal lobe function. But yeah, if you get especially if the dose is a little higher than what somebody needs, that can almost over-engage the frontal lobe, make them hyper-focus, and actually cause them to be detached from their emotions. So I've seen some kids where they almost turn into a bit of a zombie when they're on stimulant medication, especially when the dose is too high. So you got to be really careful with that. And I like Dr. Dunkley's approach where she says, you know what, I don't even want to put kids on stimulants until they've gone for at least a month or more without electronic media, because I want to see how bad their ADHD really is. A lot of times it can improve with getting away from media, doing exercise, reading actual real books, and that's behavioral interventions that can help ADHD tremendously.
What is the best type of light to use in your house to help fight depression?
So if you want to use the light boxes for depression or for seasonal affective disorder, then you want to find a light box. You can find it easily on Amazon or online. Just type in light box for SAD. But you want to make sure it's at least 7,000 lux. That's the light power, how light power is measured. So at least 7,000 lux. Most of them you'll find are advertising 10,000 lux. And then you do, and the full spectrum light. And then you do the bright white lights, which is the full spectrum. And then you do 30 minutes every morning, ideally before 8 a.m.
Do you treat people online with addictions? If so, how long and what is the cost?
So because of state licensing issues, I can only treat people in California because I'm only licensed in California. We do have some online programs, but those are not specific for addiction.
I believe my job as a customer service representative overstimulates me. Can you outline the physical effects of that and the best way to eliminate that effect? You might not want to eliminate some of the cause.
Yeah, well, of course, yeah. The effects of that are going to be related to if it is overstimulating, then the effects of stress on the body, which I had a slide in my resilience talk. If you might want to review that, but chronic stress obviously can affect every one of our body systems, including our the gut-brain connection. The immune system, prone to illness, increased risk of anxiety and depression, difficulty with memory and concentration. So those are some of the things that potentially could come out of that. So how do you deal with that? Well, of course, you want to work as much as you can to engage with those 10 resilience factors that I talked about on Thursday evening. By the way, are these going to be posted online eventually, the talks, like where people can access?
Yes, we're hoping to put them on the church's YouTube page.
Yeah. So they're already there. Okay. So then you can review those factors, because the more of those you engage with, the more you'll be able to cope with the stress. And ultimately, you got to decide whether maybe this is the right job for you or not. Sometimes it's just, these are signs. If our body and our mind are telling us you're just getting too stressed, then sometimes we have to make some hard decisions.
What age would be recommended to introduce children to screen time? Obviously, it can be hard to avoid, but if possible.
Yeah, so, my general recommendation is try to avoid screens as much as possible, ideally 0 before age 2, and then after that, very, very measured. So maybe, around age 2-ish, but with that, I would not even go to the full hour yet, because I say after, the research generally shows after age 5, you can go up to an hour, but just very small amounts incrementally, because I'll tell you, our kids, even though we don't even allow them really to use technology, we do allow them sometimes to look at pictures on like the iPad or the phone, and they're just like, I want the phone. They're just like, go after it when they see it there. It's like a magnet to them. It's just tremendous how much it attracts the young mind, and it's literally like heroin. For these kids. Some of these scientists are saying, there was one, I didn't put the quote in the lecture, but that it really is more stimulating than the effect for kids than the effects of some hardcore street drugs are for adults. So that's the kind of effect. So yeah, after age 2, maybe just a small amount, and then, but we try to really do very little. We might, at this point, our kids are 4, 8, 11, so we'll allow them to watch like a Tiny Tots 3ABN show maybe a couple times a week, and maybe we'll show them a few times a week, an animal YouTube video or something like that. But we really try to keep it minimum because, boy, they'll just get into it so quickly and it starts affecting them and they just want more and more.
What are supplements you would recommend for optimal mental health?
Well, that is a complex question because it really depends on the situation. Everyone's different, and so there's no just like, oh, well, everyone should take this. You do want to make sure that your vitamin D levels are good. So the cutoff levels, I think, are on the low side for the lab, so oftentimes the cutoff levels are like 20. But the ideal levels are probably more around 50, 55. And so you do want to make sure your vitamin D levels are decent, especially if you're vegan. You want to watch your B12 levels. So a lot of times it's important for vegans to take a B12 supplement. And then, there's conflicting research on multivitamins. There's some data that comes out and says, well, multivitamins don't make any difference. And then there's some others, there's like, no, it helps a little bit. So if you eat a really healthy, balanced diet, it's probably not necessary. But I do take one, but I think part of the reason a lot of the research shows that it doesn't make a difference is that I think a lot of the multivitamins aren't very good quality. And so if you're going to do a multivitamin, it is important to try to find a good quality one. The one I use, which I think is pretty good quality, is the Life Extensions one. But I'm actually getting into, and I'm not trying to make any sales pitch for this, there's one, Metagenics has a really nice line where they have like a phyto multivitamin, so that can maybe be a good option. And but yeah, other than that, magnesium is really important, but you can get plenty of that usually especially if you do lots of green leafy vegetables. It's interesting when you look at the chlorophyll molecule, which is in greens. It's actually the same thing. The same chemical structure as the hemoglobin molecule. You know the only difference? The only difference is that instead of iron in the middle, what do you have? Magnesium. And so it's interesting how, God, after sin came into the world, he gave human beings what? The herbs of the ground, right? Because he knew that the blood would actually become contaminated and it would need healing. And so when we eat greens, it actually helps to renew our blood in a way, which is I think it's pretty cool. So anyway, that was kind of a tangent.
What is the difference between endorphins and dopamine and its effect in the brain?
So endorphins and dopamine, they're two different chemical messengers in the brain. Endorphins are more effective with pain management. They have to do with stress management, and then also give you a sense of just a positive, like happy feeling. Okay, the dopamine is more related to motivation, and then like we talked, the sense of euphoria when you get that dopamine rush. It is interesting though, because what we do find is when something stimulates, like morphine, for example, or other opiates, when they stimulate the endorphin system, that they also stimulate the dopamine system as well. So these neurotransmitter systems, they are interrelated and they do stimulate each other.
How can you learn cognitive behavioral therapy without going to a therapist due to the cost?
So with cognitive behavioral therapy, there are some good self-help books, but the hard part sometimes is to be really self-disciplined with that. But there are some good books. One of the ones we frequently recommend is SOS Help for Emotions by Lynn Clark. And then there's one by Dr. David Burns called Feeling Great, which has helped quite a few people. So some of these, and then Telling Yourself the Truth is a really nice one as far as more of a Christian cognitive behavioral therapy perspective. And that's by William Backus. And so those are several self-help ones that can be read, but you need to really do the exercises. On our website, we actually have some free resources like the ABC worksheet, for example. And that is core when it comes to cognitive behavioral therapy. And you're welcome to go online, print out some of those and start using them, because with cognitive behavioral therapy, when you write it out, you write your ABCs, in other words, the activating event, the belief, the consequences, and then you dispute it with a truthful, rational belief, this helps you to essentially become your own therapist. But you have to do the work. That's the hard part with CBT. It's a lot of hard work, but it's totally worth it.
Speaking of exercise, does this mean treadmill, weights, etc. at a gym, or does mowing the lawn, shoveling snow, chopping wood, bike riding work as well?
Good question. So in reality, the latter is probably better for your brain, meaning when we get good exercise, truly exercise, I'm not talking about just like, oh, I get lots of steps, just walk. If you're just kind of leisurely walking, it's good, it's movement, but it's not, you want some vigorous exercise. But some of these things that were listed, like shoveling snow, bike riding, that sort of thing, those will get your heart pumping, okay? So as long as you're getting your heart pumping, science actually supports the idea of more neuroplasticity when we're doing things outdoors and we're doing things that aren't just the same repetitive movement over and over again. If you're in a gym and you're just on a treadmill or on a stationary bike, it's the same repetition over and over again. And while it's good, like it gets your heart rate up, the blood flow to the brain, it's not as good for neuroplasticity because it's the same repetitive thing. And our brain actually likes new things. It likes challenging things. It likes it when the train is changing and when you're seeing something different and that sort of thing. That's actually better for the brain.
Is there a recommended time for exercise before bed, like no screens for 1 hour before bed?
So everyone's a little different with this. I've had some people say, including my wife, she can exercise late and she likes to exercise later a lot of the times. But typically for most people, it can overactivate. And so you want to be really careful not to exercise too late. But again, everyone's a little different with that. So some people, their stress and levels from the exercise comes down quickly and they're able to go to bed rapidly. But generally speaking, and taking a walk is fine, right? I mean, I take a walk usually before I go to bed. That can be very helpful, very relaxing. But I'm talking about vigorous exercise. You probably want to not do that at least an hour or a couple hours before bed. And the other piece is, too, you don't want to do it, of course, right after you're eating as far as vigorous exercise, because that can interfere with good digestion.
Do you have any references regarding heritability of depression and anxiety? Is it DNA or environmental cause? And then what is the effectiveness of SAMe and 5-HTP activating or relaxing? Is there a best time of day or dose?
Okay, so that was like
together?
2 questions.
So
at
the
least.
first one is, do you have any references regarding heritability of depression and anxiety? Is it DNA or environmental?
Yeah, so it's a combination of both. Depression and anxiety there's often traits that are passed down. They haven't found any one specific gene that's related to depression or anxiety, but what we found is clusters or groups of genes that can be related. And it's interesting that even intrauterine, like when the baby's in the womb, there's certain genes that can be turned on or off based on the mother's stress levels. And that's really the bigger thing. It's not which genes do we have, but which ones are actually turned on or off. So they've done studies, for example, in the first study that really shed big light on this was done by Dean Ornish and some of his colleagues. They were looking at the effect of different parameters like stress levels and diet and that sort of thing on the expression of genes. And they were looking at this in prostate cancer. And what they found is that I think it was over 100 genes were either switched on or off based on the lifestyle choices that people were making that were related to prostate cancer. And they've also seen similar effects like with depression and anxiety genes as well. In other words, the choices we make day to day, the stress levels that we have, the food we eat, the amount of exercise we get, the social bonding that we get or we don't get, all of those factors influence a gene being turned on or off. So we can be susceptible to depression or anxiety, but if we're making healthy day-to-day choices, a lot of those genes can actually be turned off so that we don't have to suffer the consequences. And then what was the other one?
What's the effectiveness of SAMe and 5-HTP activating or relaxing? Is there a best time of day to take it best dose? Question.
So with SAM-E, typically that's actually one of the best, if maybe not the best, and most evidence-based supplement for depression. They've even done some studies that have compared SAM-E head-to-head with Prozac and some other antidepressants, and they found that it can be just as effective. And it also can be effective when added to an antidepressant. It doesn't work for everybody, but SAM-E definitely does tend to be more activating. And typically, we give it in the morning because of that. So I usually have people start with 400 milligrams, and then you can, after a week or two, you can go up to 800 milligrams. Some people take up to 1,600 milligrams, but typically, if you don't see any kind of response by 800 milligrams, it's usually not going to do a lot. The 5-HTP tends to be more calming. That enhances the serotonin. 5-HTP is a precursor for serotonin, and so it has more of an anti-anxiety as well as somewhat of an antidepressant effect. And so most people with 5-HTP, we have them start it in the evening time because it is more calming. It can sometimes help with sleep. And over time, people can adjust to it. Some people actually do eventually take some in the morning as well, because again, especially if they have high anxiety, it can have that calming effect.
What kind of dosing on that?
So with the 5-HTP, typically we're going to start, depending on someone's sensitivity, but typically we can start with 100 milligrams at night. And then people usually end up, between 200 and 400 milligrams at night, and maybe 100 or 200 milligrams in the morning. But certainly there are people that take even higher doses than that.
I'm hearing a lot during your seminar about how overstimulation affects your mental health. Can you speak to how some work may also cause the same effect, and what can be done to reduce/prevent that from occurring?
Yeah, so certain jobs certainly could do that, especially if you're in the, having to be on screens a lot, and depending on what you're doing with those screens. And just general stress, if the job is really stressful, it might be overstimulating, or if it's requiring a lot of multitasking, that might also play a role there as well. And what was the second part of that?
What can we do to prevent it?
What can we do to prevent it? Well, we can definitely get a different job or practice the principles of resilience. Can be helpful, at least mitigating the effect of it. But sometimes, and of course, if we're doing multitasking, can we try to batch the things that we're doing, for example, instead? Because one thing that like Cal Newport recommends, which by the way we have as one of the door prizes, Cal Newport's book on digital minimalism, which is a great book. He recommends that people batch their emails, for example, right? Instead of like checking throughout the day and continually going back from one task to the next, that you have a specific time, maybe 2 or 3 times a day, that you're checking your emails, and you allot that time for that, so you're not constantly being interrupted and going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. That is one of the most difficult and taxing things on the brain and stressful. And so even with my phone, for example, most of the day I have it on silent mode, not just like the volume off, but literally do not disturb. And then I check it when I am ready to check it. Does that make sense? So that I'm not constantly being interrupted. And that's better for me to be able to keep my attention. And you can set it so that if my wife calls, it will come through, even on the do not disturb, because I have it set that way. And that way, if it's an emergency or something, so that's just an example, yeah.
What is your opinion on EMDR therapy?
EMDR, so eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. So this is a therapy that is typically used with someone that has gone through significant trauma in their lives, and essentially they have people moving their eyes back and forth, and usually some kind of stimulus, whether it's lights or some kind of buzzing in their hands or something like this, to help to stimulate both sides of the cerebral cortex. Well, there is research that shows that it can be helpful for processing past trauma. frankly, I have mixed feelings about it because I think there are better therapies. I like the cognitive processing therapy because I think it actually provides a greater sense of meaning and really helps people to work through the trauma. EMDR experts would probably argue with me and say, well, the EMDR also helps you to process through and to deal with it and lay it to rest. There's probably some truth to that. I just think that it's trying to be almost a little too much of a shortcut, and some people can actually be re-traumatized by doing it that way because it's such a shortcut. Some people are concerned that maybe there's elements that are related to hypnosis. I don't think it's actually hypnosis, but there is some concern that maybe we're kind of putting the therapist in a little bit too much control, which again would be on the hypnotic spectrum. So that's why I say I have mixed feelings, but I've also had some people say that it helped them so much. And so, I'm a little on the fence, but I lean a little bit more away from it rather than towards it. Again, I think there's other things that are better.
Are there any Christian counselors in our area in Coeur d'Alene?
I'm sure there's some.
I can help. So there are, Deanna has some resources out in the foyer if you'd like to look. Also on Shine 1049, they have some different community partners, and they have some different Christian counselors listed on their website that you could access. Also, Focus on the Family keeps a list of Christian counselors. So if you call their 1-800 number and say you're looking for a Christian counselor in Spokane or Coeur d'Alene area, they also could supply you with a list of resources. Also, if you go to Psychology Today, you can enter in your zip code, and then you can list different qualities you want in a counselor. And I believe a Christian counselor is one of the things you can, a search criteria you can check. And there is, if you just Google Christian Counselors Spokane, there is a group. There's a website that a whole bunch of counselors have come together and created this website, and you can go and you can read their bios, and it will tell you where they're practicing. So are some resources to find counselors in the area.
And thank you. That's really good. And one caveat there is, just remember, any counselor, even if they claim to be Christian, I'm not saying we should be overly skeptical, but just make sure that they're truly biblically grounded, because there's some people that say that they're Christian counselors, but may not really believe in the Word of God, and they might bring some strange ideas in. And we're very influenced by counselors. The research shows that we tend to adopt their values over time, especially if you see that counselor for a long time, even if you're not overtly talking about your religious beliefs and that sort of thing.
How do we connect with our adult children who are somewhat emotionally distant and not interested in religion, especially if they live far away?
Yeah, that can be challenging, especially if they live far away. And this was for adult children? So, but I think the best thing that we can do is try to get involved in some levels in their world. In other words, understand what's important to them. And obviously there's probably going to be some things that you just can't condone and get involved with because they're maybe worldly activities, etc. But you want to understand what's important to them and where can we meet? What are the common points? And show interest in that and see how we can even help them when there's help needed. But I think just showing interest in their lives in however we can and being proactive with that, not pushing ourselves on them, but and showing them that we still love and care even if they are opposed to religion at this time.
If depression is because of pain, is there any therapy to improve pain perception?
Yeah, so that is a great question. There's actually a interesting cognitive behavioral therapy book. I think it's called Unlearn Your Pain. You've heard of that before?
And I believe they have a website out of University of Michigan.
That could be,
And there's some
yeah.
online modules that can go with it.
Yeah. So I've heard some good things about that. Again, it does take some real effort, which is hard when you're in pain to go through. And so what I would suggest is go through that. Again, the book is Unlearn Your Pain. But try to get support while you're going through that from either a professional counselor or some other support system so that you can actually see it through, because otherwise it can be really challenging. But yes, pain is there's a physical element to it, but then the perception of it is in here. And so the more we work on how we can deal with that perception with CBT, that can actually help. It's not going to make the pain go away, but it can help us deal with it.
Okay, and I think this is our last question, and it says, according to Colin D. and Russell R. Stonelish, depression, suicide, a result of selfishness. Is this true or not? Why or why not?
Well, I think we have to be really careful about that because depression and suicide, although there are symptoms of depression which can eventually lead to suicidal thoughts and sometimes suicidal actions that are, we might say, self-inflicted in our selfish decisions that we make. For example, if we are just looking at gratifying ourselves, which is a selfish action, don't you think that could lead to some depression? Yes. But that doesn't mean that everybody that has depression, it's just because they were selfish, okay? So there are so many different factors that play a role here. Sometimes it's a genetic predisposition, plus a lot of stress growing up, plus some bad decisions we've made along the way. And to then just say, well, you're depressed because you're selfish, I think is very unfair. And yes, we all as human beings have a measure of selfishness, right? That God is working for us to overcome. And we need to be careful because what we're doing there is we're saying, hey, look, you wouldn't have this problem if you weren't selfish. But when we're pointing the finger, there's 3 pointing back at us and we're just as selfish. And now on top of it, we're being critical too, right? And judgmental. So I would be very, very careful with making statements like that. Instead, why not approach each other with a compassionate attitude and say, hey, how can I be of support to this person instead of being judgmental and like, you brought this on yourself. Now, I'm not saying we should just enable people and allow them to continue down that path of self-destruction. We do want to encourage them to take accountability for the bad lifestyle decisions, etc. But we also don't want to judge or criticize. So it's a fine balance. Okay, so I think that's our last one.
Very good. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Binus. We really appreciate all that you've taught us.
Sure. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Already, I think Pastor Teddy is the man of the hour because he is going to figure out who gets to take home some door prizes.
Oh my. All right. Let's see if we have any young people that could help out.